What's up everybody, welcome back to my channel. So today's video I am doing the best / most surprising books of 2021. I am super excited for this video. This is kind of my favorite video to watch every year, so I was super excited to make my own this year, even though I had done one last year, but that's a horrible video. Don't go watch it. It's like my first video I've ever filmed, so I would not recommend you guys to go watch it. While I was compiling my list, it was a lot harder than what I thought it would be. I read about 110 books this year, which is the most I've ever read in my life, so that's good, but it also made it really hard for me to find the best book of the year. So all of these books, basically my reasoning for choosing these books are books that had a lasting impression on me. So these are not all of the books that I gave 5 stars, and I didn't even give 5 stars to all of these books, which I know does not make any sense, but in my mind it kind of does. And these are in no particular order because I could not put them in order for the life of me. I tried, but it was not happening. I am filming this on the 31st of December, so I waited until the very last day of the year to film this video, and I'm so glad that I did because the last book that I've read this year was amazing and made it to this list. So I'm super happy that I waited until the very last day to film this video. I'm very sorry for this extremely long intro, but without further ado, let's get right into this list. Like I said, in no particular order, I'm gonna go right into them. The first book that I want to talk to you guys about is one book that surprised me so much, and it's going to be 56 Days by Catherine Ryan Howard. This is not one of the best books that I've read this year, really not, but I was so surprised about how much I liked this book and I enjoyed this book, and how much I sometimes think about this book even after reading it. I've read this like a few months ago now, and I still sometimes think about some scene in this book. This is a COVID related thriller. It's about this girl and this guy who start dating right before quarantine hits, and so they decide to quarantine together, and then 56 days after, one of them is found dead, and we're kind of just getting to know what happened as everything is happening in the story as well. This is the very first COVID related book that I've read, which I think is why this made a lasting impression on me. There's just some scene in this book that I still think about, and that has nothing to do with the actual story, but more about the COVID related thing in this book, which is kind of why I wanted to put this book on this list. Like I said, this is not one of the best books that I've read this year. It's just one that made an impression on me, and I still think about a few things in this book, and I just could not put this on this list. Maybe it's more like an honorable mention more than an actual best book, but I got sucked into this book. I read it so quickly, and I still think about this book to this day, so I just could not put it here. Which I'm probably the only one who's gonna put this book on this list. I don't know, for whatever reason this book kind of marked me, and I still think about this book, so I had to put it on this list. And it's also my only thriller book, so maybe it has something to do with it, but I have read a lot of thriller this year, so I don't know, I don't know. The next book that I want to talk to you guys about is one that I've talked about a lot in the beginning of the year because I read it earlier this year, and it's going to be The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I read this like in March maybe, or April, or maybe even for February. I don't know when I read it, but I read it really early this year, and this book was so good. I loved this book so much. I fell in love with the story. I fell in love with these characters. I just could not put this book down. This got a lot of hype when it first came out, like last year I think, so I was pretty nervous picking this one up, especially since it's not my like regular genre. I mean, I guess I love fantasy, but this is more like a magical realism book. It's about this guy who works for the government. He works for the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs. No, that's not it at all. He works for the department in charge of magical youth, because in this world there are magical creatures, but the government are in charge of them, and so they live in orphanage, and he, Linus, our main character, is basically in charge of going into this orphanage and making sure everything is up to par, up to code, and making sure these orphanage can stay open. And one day he gets a really mysterious task, and he has to go to this orphanage where there's this really mysterious creature, and then there's a love story in this book as well. This was just so cute and it was amazing, and I loved this book so much. This was so cozy, it was just everything, and I love this book, and I've been thinking about rereading this book a lot, which doesn't happen to me very often because I don't reread books very often. So this book was so good. I loved it. This is one of the best books that I've read this year, and everybody needs to read this. Yes, it was so good. Next book that I want to talk to you guys about is going to be Amari and the Night Brother by B.B. Alston. I read this book once again earlier this year, and this is a middle grade book. It was so good, guys. Once again, this book has been getting so much hype on BookTube and everywhere else as well, so I was super nervous to pick it up, but this is totally deserving of all of its hype. It's about this girl whose brother disappeared one day, and then she gets a letter from this is the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs. Basically, she finds a briefcase in his closet containing a nomination for a summer tryout at the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, and she goes there. It's a magic school. This was so good. I love this book so freaking much. I love Amari's character. I love this book so much. I cannot wait to read the sequel, which is gonna come up next year, I think, hopefully. It was everything you would hope for a middle grade book, but even as an adult, I loved this book. It was super funny. It was action packed at the same time. It had everything you would want to in a book. Go pick this book up. It was amazing. Next book that I want to talk to you guys about is completely different but equally as good, and it is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. I read this book twice this year, guys, and this is not a small book. It's a pretty big book. I read this book one time physically, and then the other time I read it as an audiobook, and it was just so good, so surprising as well. Once again, this is a recurring theme apparently, but this has been getting a lot of hype, so I was quite nervous about this book, but it's totally deserving of all of its hype. This book is kind of a hard one to summarize. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it's about this family who lives in this small village on this small piece of land, and they're kind of set in the old ways, but everyone around them has passed them. They have technology and everything, but not this village. They've stayed in the old ways, and they have magic abilities that kind of resemble water bending, I guess. And one day they're like under attack, and I mean, there's so much thing about this book. It's hard to summarize, but this was so good. I got hooked to this book from the very first page. Honestly, the very first scene when they're like going up a mountain to this school, I just got hooked to this book. But a lot of people say the first half of the book is slower, and then something happens in the middle of the book and you get like sucked in. This book has some of the best characters that I've read like ever, the best growth as well. And I will say though, this is a really sad book and a really depressing book. I would not read this book if you're like dealing with depression, so do keep that in mind if you want to pick this book up. But honestly, this is totally worth it. This is very different than a like regular fantasy as well, I want to say. It feels different, it has a different vibe. It's so good. Go pick it up. This is amazing. The next book that I want to talk to you guys about is one that I read earlier this year, and I've talked about a lot on my channel, but not lately, so I feel like I can talk about it again. And it's going to be Black Sun by Roanhorse. I read this, I think, in March. And oh my god, this was so surprising. I kind of picked this book up on a whim because I loved the cover. It was a new release, not a lot of people were talking about it. But I just picked it up, like I said, because I was intrigued by the cover. I did not know anything about this book going into it, which was a good and a bad thing, because the first chapter, is it first chapter or just first scene? I don't remember. But the first chapter was something. I know everyone talks about the first chapter, but go with it. Maybe look up some trigger warning because this book was weird. It was a good weird, but it was weird. This follows a few different characters and it also has a few different timelines. So the beginning for me was a little bit confusing and a little bit hard to get into, but once you get into it and once you like understand everything, I love this book. It's very different than anything that I've read. Like I said, this book is weird. The first chapter is something, but it doesn't necessarily indicate how the rest of the book will be. So if you don't love the first chapter, push through a little bit and maybe you're still gonna love this book. This is another book that's hard to describe. It's about this one guy who has been prepared all of his life for like this event, this moment in time. And then we're also following a girl who is a captain of a ship who needs to bring someone to a city at a specific moment. You're also following a priestess. You're following like a few different characters. Like I said, it's a hard book to describe, but please, if you are interested in this book, pick this one up. It is so good. I loved it. It was really good and I cannot wait to read the sequel. The next book that I want to talk to you guys about is the last book that I've read in 2021, and it's also my only romance book on this list, and it's going to be The Love Hypothesis by Hazelwood. Oh my god, guys, this was so good. Like, this was so good. I love this book so much. This is a romance book about this girl named Olive who like one day randomly kisses this guy because her best friend is interested in this guy that she dated, like barely dated for like a few dates. Olive is saying like, yeah, you can go on a date with him, like it's fine, we're like, I'm over him, but then her best friend is like, no, this is like girl code, I don't want to go there. So in order for her to prove to her best friend that she's over this guy, she kisses this random guy that the first guy that you see. Enters Adam. He is this professor in this university and he's like kind of this grumpy hero, and it's their love story. They kind of start fake dating because he has a reason that he would want to fake date as well. I loved Olive so much. I related to her on so many levels. I just loved her so much, and I loved Adam as well. I just love how he was this grumpy hero in the beginning, but we get to know him as he like opens up to Olive. I loved the love story. I loved the slow burn in this book. I just loved this book so freaking much. I even like tabbed it, which I don't normally tab romance book, but I even ended up tabbing this book a little bit. It was super funny. It got frustrating at times. 100% deserving of all of its hype that it's getting lately. If you are interested in romance book, read this one. It is like an academia setting as well. It was just so good. Go pick it up. I highly recommend this book. It was amazing. The next book that I want to talk to you guys about, it's another really surprising book for me because it's a horror book, which I don't normally read a lot of horror book, but this one was really good, and it is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. I need to read it because it's such a complicated title, so I need to read it, and I don't have a copy with me, so I will put a picture right here. But guys, this book was so good. It took me by surprise. I did not expect to like this book so much. This book got me out of a reading slump as well. I was in the biggest reading slump until I read this book. It had everything you would want in a book. It was funny. It had some horror scenes, some gory scene as well. It was so good. It's about these group of women who lives in the South in the mid 90s, I think, or mid 80s. And they have a book club, so they join every week and they talk about the book that they're reading. And then one day this new guy moves in town and he is acting weird and he may or may not be a vampire. This is not the type of book that I read normally, but it was so good. It had some funny parts. It was frustrating as well because it talks a lot of like women during that time and like it has a lot of social comments, but it's done so well, and there's funny aspects to this book. It was so good. I highly recommend this book for like spooky seasons. I would just go read it if you're interested in it. It was everything that I needed at that time. Yeah, I just love that book so much. I want a physical copy of that book as well, because I do want to reread that book too one day. And the last book that I want to talk to you guys about today, if I were to rank this book, I think this book would be like top first place. I say that, but at the same time I keep changing in my mind. But this book, I adored this book so much, and it is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is the very first book that I've read by Andy Weir, so I have nothing to compare it, but this book was so good. This is sci-fi, which I don't normally read, so I was super surprised of how much I enjoyed this book. This is about this guy who wakes up in the space, but he's the only one on his mission to wake up, and he does not remember anything, and he is slowly remembering why he is there. And so we're getting to know why he was sent to space as he is remembering things. And this book was so good. I loved the friendship in this book with this guy, with Rocky. Rocky is like the best character ever. I loved Rocky so much. This book made me cry, it made me laugh, it made me fall in love with like these characters. This book was everything. I love this book so much. The only complaint I have about this book is it got a little too sciencey for me at some point. But you don't need to understand everything in order to enjoy this book, which is one of the reasons why I love this book so much, because even though I didn't understand everything, I still enjoyed this book so much. I really want to read more of Andy Weir's like work from now on, and I cannot wait for the movie adaptation. But this, like I said, if I were to rank all of these books, I think this would be #1. I kind of want to say this would be #1. Because it was everything. I did listen to the audiobook, which was amazing, so I highly recommend the audiobook for this one. It was everything. I love this book so freaking much. This is it. These were all the books that I wanted to talk to you guys about today. These were all of the best book / most surprising books that I've read this year. Have you read any of them? I would love to know your thoughts on them in the comments down below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys have a wonderful day or night depending on when you're watching this, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!